Hey, welcome back. So today we're going to take a quick look at how can we break up our render into separate passes, how do we add some AOVs, and how can we use those in the comp to add in some of those little details that might be more expensive to render 3D than it would be to just kiss them in 2D, especially for things like environments where maybe there's not a lot of motion, where it's far away. Volumetrics can be really expensive to render, so why not get away with what we can inside a comp? Let's take a look. Okay, let's go ahead and set up this file for rendering. So currently, what I like to do is I tend to like to break up my renders so I have a foreground, a midground, a background. If you're rendering elements to go on a plate, you obviously are going to break those up based on those elements. You know, your character might be an element. You can break up your scene, whatever makes the most sense. But for our purposes and what we're doing here, we're going to go ahead and just set this up so that way we can have some rendered layers to play with. So here's our scene that we've worked with in the past. So what's coming in here is we are bringing in a bunch of variants of trees, and then they're being scattered. And then this is the overall terrain that's been written out to disk, so we're not calculating all this stuff over and over again. So we wrote this out to a USD using the graph stages to kind of set this up and put it all underneath this terrain. Oh, that's good to see. That's already trying to go through all that stuff again. So then that loads in. I'm applying my materials. Oh, sorry, these are render geometry settings. There's already materials on them that was all set up here. We have some lights. All right, ideally you have pieces of geometry that you can use as your, kind of your different pieces. So let's try that first. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a prune node, and I'm going to break out the parts of this that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and say for this prune, I'm going to select for a pattern. I'll come down here under terrain. I'm going to go ahead and use, I think we'll use the mountain there. Yeah, so we're going to throw the mountain on this prune pattern, and we're going to say prune unselected. And so then when we view this and we select it, we have just our mountain. Now, the one problem with this is you're only going to get the mountain. In this case, do I get my materials too? I think these are underneath the mountain there. Nope, they're not. So I'll lose all my materials. I won't get any of that. So I'm going to make sure I get the materials as well. I'm going to make sure that I get my lights because I want that. And I'm going to make sure I get my camera. And in this case, because this does interact with my trees, which I'm going to render on a separate pass, I'm going to go ahead and tell it I want it to get the instancer as well. So I'm going to throw down one more. Now, you could put multiples into this if you wanted. I just think, for me, it's cleaner to look at this and be able to look down the list and say, okay, this is what I'm pulling out, instead of going through and saying, all right, you have a big long list that extends out past this and it's hard to read. So this is the way I like to use this. So there's a make invisible, and then there's a deactivate. Like, the deactivate means, like, wipe that stuff out. Like, I don't want it to affect anything. Don't load it into memory. The make invisible, some stuff will still pull in, and so I usually don't use the make invisible for this process. So now with this set up, I can drop down a karma node, which is just my render settings. I can put this on here, and in this case, this is my background most mountains. So I'll go ahead and call this on the render ROP here. I'll call this BG, or you can call them BG mountains, right? It's up to you. This case, we're just going to render the current frame is fine. I don't want this to be on CPU. That's set up here. We're going to come to the XPU engine on Karma here. I'm going to go ahead and render this out at HD. I want to set it to which camera I want it to use. So it looks like camera 1 is the default. Sweet, that's great. I can come in here and change any of this that I want to make this more favorable to whatever my flavor of pipeline that I like. And that's great. So we have some limits here. We can reduce the reflection limit, the refraction limit. This will speed up our render just a little bit. I don't want depth of field on. I don't want motion blur. I'm going to turn those off. Now is the important part. We're going to come to image output. So right away, we can come up here to this quick setup and say optimization AOVs, and that'll generate a whole bunch of stuff for us. I encourage you to take a look at those. It turns on a whole bunch of things, but for now, we're going to operate a little light. So we'll go ahead and stick with the beauty. And what I want to do is on these lights, under Karma, I want to scroll down and I want to enable this LPE tag. And for the value, I'm going to say $OS. So what that's going to do is it's going to give me this, for every render output that we create, when we turn on split per LPE tag, it's going to give me the contribution of that light for that pass. So in this case, for beauty, we'll leave it all together, but then we'll open up diffuse, and I'm going to do combined diffuse. You can get into like all this, this stuff to really be able to rebuild it in comp. I'm not going to go that far. If a compositor asks me for it, I'll do it, but for now, I'll just say combined diffuse, and then I'm going to come down to reflections and refractions and say combined glossy, and I'll say I don't need those, and I want glossy transmission. I'll turn that on. And then this is if you have visible lights. This is how you can, so if you had an actual light in the scene that you wanted to render as its own pass, you could do that. I'll turn on combined emission. Some of these things won't have anything in them. If I have volumes that I'm rendering, I would turn on combined volume split. If I have subsurface scattering, I could use that. Albedo can be useful, right? Just outputs the general albedo pass. And now the real thing that are really important is I get down into these, and it's world space is a must-have. Depth is a must-have. I like to have UVs. If I want, I can then use, there are some functions within Nuke, I don't know about Natron, that will allow me to then map a texture onto that UV pattern, which can be very useful. The normals can be very useful. And then if I'm doing motion blur, usually you'll write those out as motion vectors. Okay, now there's a couple more things that are nice to have. We'll drop down and pop open this extra render vars. And when we click this, this is basically a lot of the things we just saw up above, but some other passes that can be really useful are holdout passes. What's some of these other ones? And then cryptomats. So usually what I'll do is I'll do a cryptomat that's object-based, and then I'll do a cryptomat that's material-based. I comp at home in Natron, which doesn't really take advantage of cryptomats. There's a couple of cryptomat nodes that don't ever seem to work. So, but cryptomats are a big thing. So having those two set up are really important. So now we have our basics. The last thing that I want to do here is because I want to put the trees on their own layer, because this has flying trees and that's not cool. So I want to put down a render geometry settings node. And I'm going to come down to my trees, or my instancer here, and I'll put that in as my primitive. And then I'm going to scroll down. Should be under shading. And say under render visibility, I'm going to set this into phantom. So, and now that'll give me shadows of those trees onto any geo, but not the geo itself. So I think I actually want one other piece of geometry in this, which would be not the lake bed, but this hill. So we're going to add to our prune one more thing. So we're going to say primitive pattern, sorry, we'll add one more, and we're going to grab our hill, drop that in, and then we already have our materials, so that should pick up. Now, I can test this by setting my viewport here, my display here. I can come in and drop down and say Karma XPU, and then this will render using these Karma settings. Okay, so one of the things we can see here, as we have this big pool of light, that actually, this grid here is also supposed to be in the scene. So we'll have to include that in the prune. We have to make sure that our lighting matches up. When we break everything apart, we have to remember that all of these things influence each other and how they're lit, how they're shaded. You know, so we can see here, you can see how this is a long render, that these trees are casting shadows over here, so all of that's important. So I know that this is supposed to be in shadow, so I'm missing a piece, and it's this grid right here. So I can just come in here, add another piece, and say slash terrain grid 1. There, now we have all the pieces. This will take forever to restart and re-render. This is not the fastest render I've ever made, but I'm gonna go ahead and break these other pieces out. So we've got the idea. Okay, so we're gonna just go ahead and say Houdini GL. That'll save us some time. Because one of the other things that we want to be aware of is that you can't just prune everything out. Some things can just be pruned out. Other things need to have their render geometry settings changed to either primary or to phantom, or set as holdouts, so that way they cut out the alpha channel and they can go back together. So let's look at that. All right, so now I know that I want to go ahead and render my lake bed and then my shore and my water together. So we'll kind of have this background mountain, this foreground piece, and then my trees. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to just copy this whole setup, paste it. Now I'm going to keep all of this the same, but instead of the mountain here, I'm going to include the lake bed. Oh, sorry, actually, we're going to do this one. This one is not going to use the prune. So this one, we kind of want all the pieces. And what instead I'm going to use is a render geometry settings node. And for this, I want to modify the mountain and the hill, because we've already have those. Those already exist in our BG Mountains pass. So I'm going to drag these over to here. These are what I'm going to modify. And what I want to do is come down here to shading and enable this holdout mode and set this to be matte. And what that'll do is it allows this to cut out excuse me, cut out the mountains where it intersects with those pieces of geometry. So then when we render this, our we'll call this FG Lake Shore, we can just drop over the top and it'll all line up properly. Now the last thing we need is we're going to need our trees. And so we're going to do something similar to this. We'll just copy and paste this again, and we will call this trees. And now for the primitives that we're setting to be holdouts are going to be all this, right? So the hill, the lake bed, the mountain, the shore. So now those will properly cut out of the trees. We want the grid in there. The grid's off frame, so it doesn't matter. Oh, sorry, we also want the water probably in that. I don't think the water matters as much, but if we don't have it in there, it's going to do some weird things. So we really want the shore, hill, yep, all that. And so now if we render this, this is going to give us just our trees, right? So with that selected on our view there, let's go to camera 1, and we're going to go ahead and say render XPU. Okay, so there you go. There was one other thing. I remembered we have to take out the render geometry settings for the trees that make them not render. So now we have kind of our 3 different render passes set up. We've got all of our AOVs that we want isolated out. We can see those here as this renders. We can just click the little sunglass, or sorry, the viewing output here, and we can see there's all the things we've set up. So we have our combined diffuse. Let's deselect that. So we have a combined diffuse that's rendering. We have albedo that's rendering. Oh, look, it's pulled all the things in for albedo. We have our depth, which is going to give us our depth of everything. Glossy transmission. There's our glossy transmission for these for the dome light and then our regular light. So this is what I was talking about, where we have two different lights. So we have our combined diffuse, and then we have our combined diffuse dome light 1 and light 1. So there's dome light 1, and there's combined diffuse light 1. Okay, so once we render these out, it's all in comp's hands. All right, so we can see here we've got some renders. So today we're really focusing on how do we go about taking a render and leveling that up without the heavy costs of extra render time in 3D. So let's leverage some of these render passes that we can generate. So firstly, I've broken out my renders into my sky pass. I've got a foreground pass. I've got a midground pass, and then I've got my absolute deep background pass. So let's just quickly throw these together. I'm just gonna put down some merges here. And again, this is Natron. It's very much like Nuke. You can also comp in Fusion's Digital Fusion by Blackmagic. You could comp in, I think Blender can be set up as a compositor. Excuse my voice, I've been sick. You can use Houdini's cops to do this as well. So, but we're gonna use Natron, so that's what I've got. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with my backgroundmost layer, and that's my sky. So we'll take a look, here's my sky. And then I'm just gonna throw over my BG layer over my sky. Okay. And I can just keep layering these up on top of each other, or I can, put these each into their own kind of level. And we'll kind of go through this, and I'll probably work this several different ways as we do this. There's a lot of ways to achieve what we're looking for. So let's just start by taking these and putting these all into one kind of image here. So we can see here I've got a render. It has mountains. We've got our backgroundmost mountains, we've got our midground mountains, we've got our foreground and our sky, and then when we look at it all together, it's doing some interesting things, but it's everything feels artificial, right? And granted, not the greatest render in the world. These tree assets are okay, but excuse me, it should work. So let's look at how do we start taking this and getting this into a place where it's going to feel visually more interesting. When we look at our different passes, I'll start with these background mountains. In this particular one, what I've broken out here is my position pass, and I've broken out depth. And you can see here as I mouse over, there's going to be a value down here that kind of shows you, how big this scene is. When we merge these all together, I think we kind of lose that depth pass, and we just end up with our color, right? So RGB. Oh, something's strange here with our viewer. There we go. So let's start with one at a time. So one of the things that I like to do is, depth is a big thing. You can either combine your depth or render out a depth pass that is the entire scene all together, or you can deal with the individual pieces as they come out of the render. For this, we're just going to use each pass as its own associated depth layer. So if I do a channel node, I believe it's called, oh, it's a shuffle, sorry. It's the same as Nuke. It works a little differently than Nuke's does. So in the B input here, you can see that that's B, and it's taking color down to alpha. So we're going to go down to depth, and we'll just put depth into all these channels. And then I'll zero out my alpha. So we look at this, there's my depth. Actually, what I'm going to do is alpha is going to be taking my original alpha. So we can see here, there's my alpha, right? And the reason for that is when you do depth-based images, use depth-based comping, if you have a value of 0 here, but then we look here, our value is like 14 million. That means 0 is actually closer to us than this is, so you'll get some issues. And the way we can deal with that is we can put down a constant node, and we can either go and find, like, what is the highest value here? 157,000 looks to be it, so we're just going to say 200,000. So we'll say 200,000, and we'll merge this over this. And so now when we look, we're still at our 150,000-ish, in these areas, and then we jump up to 200,000. And that'll become clearer. So, okay, so now what I want to do is I want to use my depth pass, and I'm just going to go ahead and color correct my image here. Now, usually what people will do is do this, and there's controls and like shake. Everything's trying to get better about making sure that your masks don't get messed up, but I'll tell you, there's nothing better to me than old school, making sure that you're unpremulting and then copying in a clean alpha channel to be sure, and there'll be compositors that tell me that's not how you do it, and that's totally fine. I love it that people have different opinions. All right, so I'm going to pull this into here, that'll be my color pass. And then I'll take from A's alpha, so now I have a clean alpha, and now I can pre-multiply that. So there we go. So now when I look at this, nothing's happening. But if I look here at my color correction, if we look up at this edge, right, we'll see that that edge is going to get unpremultiplied, which allows us to get better, more correct results. We won't get dark edges or bright edges around as we adjust this. Okay, so now we've got this color channel over here, or this mask over here, which is our depth. But how do we use this? Well, an easy way is just, I'm going to throw down a grade node, and I'm going to tell it to clamp white and clamp black. And I know the farthest away was 100, and so we'll say 160,000. And now you can see we have a graduation that goes back in space. So if I now connect this here, and on my color correct, excuse me, I want to make sure I'm using like the red channel instead of the alpha. Now I can come back and look at this. And based on this, I can do things like I can offset. Instead of a color correct, I'm going to use a grade node. I like the controls better on a grade than a color correct. So I'm going to take this, and I'll end up probably using both, but I'm going to tell that mat to be the red channel again. And now what I can do is I can just start lifting up a little bit, right? And what this is doing is it's using the distance between these two to lift up. And so I can actually make adjustments on this where maybe this, I'll make this 10,000, 1, 2, 3 is my black point. And that'll push forward. Oh, let's go even further, right? So now I can have this sense of fall off that's going off in the distance to get me that sense of atmospheric perspective, right? That the mountains further away are going to have more of that stack up on it. Now, ideally, we kind of set this up in a look that kind of works overall. Oh, oops, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to do it on the black point. Sometimes I'll also desat it a little bit. There's other things that we can do. The lift might be not just like an overall. We might come in here and lift up a little bit more in the blue, so it gives it kind of that blue haze just a little bit. So maybe we would try that and say great. So 0.7, you can see now there's just a cool tint to that, kind of the way that atmospheric perspective gets filled in that sense. So again, this is where the artistry and the mood you're trying to create starts to set in. So let's look at our merge here, and let's just go ahead and drop this in now and change it. All of a sudden, oh, that sets back, and suddenly that's kind of interesting what that's starting to do. So let's just take this same setup, right? And I'm going to go ahead and put a dot after this guy, make it a little easier. And I'm just going to copy this whole thing. select it, I'll hit paste. Oh, it's not like Houdini, it doesn't paste it in line. Okay, and so already there, I didn't have to do any adjustment. I just dropped this on, right? And I can go in and with each of these, I can make adjustments if I want, but I don't have to. You know, ideally, it's just set up in a way that it does what it's supposed to do. And now we already get a sense of a depth moving back and away from us. So what else can we do, right? What are some of the other things that we can then push this around with? Well, let's first off, we didn't end up getting any here on our foreground, so we might make an adjustment there. So I could come in now and say, great, let's just adjust that matte. And so instead of making this 10,000, let's make this 1. So that comes all the way forward. Okay, so that didn't do much. So then we're gonna remove a 0 off of this and see if this starts to bring us forward. No. So this is way closer than everything else. Right, so you can see that now that's starting to get an effect back there. And we can now take this and push this back a little bit, say maybe 40. Oh, no, 10. There we go. So now that's starting to sit back into that. So we've taken this and we've pushed that into the distance by using that fall off. So, trying to find, that nice little sweet spot that feels good. So I'm going to say that's it for now. So what else? What else can I do? Well, this is where this same idea, now using our world position, we can do something similar. And so I'm going to start and I'm going to build this on my midground. So I'm going to come into here and I'll do something similar where I'm going to pull off a shuffle node. And instead of depth, this is going to be P. And I'll do each one of those channels. So now if we look at this, this is what our position channel looks like. And what this represents is the X is in red, the Y is in green, and the Z is in blue. So we can see how far away those distances are in world space. So in this particular scene that we set up, the camera was looking right down the Z-axis. So that's why it looks like this grid. If we were off to the side, it would look a little different. But what I want to use is I want to use the Y. So I'm going to go ahead and put down a grade node. This is already unpre-multiplied, so I don't need to do anything there. It comes out of the render that way. And what I'm going to focus on is the green channel. And we can see here if I go up to the top, that's looks like 22,000, and down at the bottom it's going to be 0, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I want it to be dark down here, or white down here, and then dark up top. And so again, I'm going to do the same thing here. I probably we'll go with just this. Let's see how this goes. We may have to do this same gag. I can't recall. Let's see. So I'm gonna keep my white point at 0, and I'm gonna make my black point at 5,000. And so there you see now I get a graduation that's going up based on that distance. And you can see here that now I'm getting this kind of, it's white back here. I didn't want that. This is that whole thing where I'm just going to copy this. So copy and paste. And that did something fun. So let's look at this. Alpha channel. Look at that. Oh, what? These are those trees. So if you look, check that out. So you see we have crazy results in our alpha channel. So if we look at this, there's some pixels in there that are less than 1. And then we merge it over this and suddenly we get crazy values. So this is where you have to start kind of, messing with things. I could put a grade on, and for my alpha channel, clamp to white. And we'll look at this. look here. That seemed to fix it. So sometimes this is why like your alpha channel is such an important thing to pay attention to. All right, so let's go back to our green channel. This does some strange things. All right, so in my throwing this down and clamping the white, it was clamping the RG and B channels, which we actually don't want. So now if we look at this, we go back into our green RGB, it looks correct. We come to here, it looks like this, whereas if these were on, it looks like that. So we're going to turn those off. And then we'll look at this grade here. And now if we're looking at just the green channel, we should see that we're getting that graduation. Now those trees are picking up strangely. All right, so half the fun of dealing with renders and comp is trying to solve the problems that come out. So in sampling, which is an issue, is it's sampling our trees which have opacity built into them. The way that asset was built, this was run without a mid-res or a low-res tree that was so it was using our actual trees with pine needles to render. What that did was it created some values in the alpha channel where the trees were that were less than 1, which should not have been the case. So by setting the white point, right, and again, remember, this is only affecting the alpha channel here. We've turned off the influence of R, G, and B, and I've set the white point to be 0.9, clamping the white point. That now cleans that up. So if we go back to this being 1, we see the trees all kind of poking through, and what we're seeing is there's a hole there, so we're seeing back to this crazy high value that we stuck on this card. And so we're going to go ahead and take this and make this 0.9. That cleans that up. Now when we look at our gradient, if we look at the green channel, is doing what we'd expect, even where we can see some little bits of the tops of the trees, which is somewhat what I would expect. So there's a few other little strange things up in here that I would track down on the next iteration of the renders to try to fix, but this will give us the general idea. So one of the things is I want this out here to be black. So maybe I don't want this. Let's see here. Well, that didn't help. Okay, well that's there you go. That's funny that this, I would have expected this to yield that same thing, but it didn't. So, well, we'll give it that. So now we've got what I would expect. So this is the target that I was aiming for. So now that I have this becomes, again, another mask for grading. So, and I'm going to put this here. I can just add as many different color effects that I want to do, some compositing effects that I want to do in this same pre-multiply chain. Come on. Let's do this. Let's take this up. I'm at a point like so I can see this a little easier. There we go. Okay, so we're going to turn off the green here, and I'm going to take this grade and I'm going to plug it in to this grade node, right, which is giving us that ramp. And for this one's mask, I'm going to tell it to be the green channel. That's what we were manipulating with. So now I can do the same thing. I can lift up a little bit, and let's just take a look at what that does. Right, so now we've got a sense of a low-lying haze in our little valley. Right, so this becomes really powerful in creating kind of that a settled atmosphere that's kind of sit down around. It helps to separate my trees. Without this, my trees get lost a little bit, and this suddenly becomes a little bit more majestic, a little more interesting looking. So you can quickly see how just with a couple of of control channels, we can quickly go and make some really awesome looking effects that help to kind of blend this all together. Lastly, one of the things that I like to do is put an edge wrap on things. That can really help to, sit this in together. There's a lot of different ways to do that. They're usually called light wraps. So we'll use just a light wrap node here. And this is where I'm going to come over here, and what it's looking for is my background, which is going to be my sky, and then my foreground. So what I want to do is I want to be able to use my foreground without the sky. So I'm going to break my sky off of my setup here. So I should really kind of rebuild this. So this should be B, and this should be A, and then that's going to be A2. Let's check it to make sure. Yep, we're still ordered in the right way. We are. And now we'll put down another merge node. This will be my foreground. My background is going to be my sky. And now let's take our light wrap and let's plug this foreground into the light wrap. And what we'll see is that it returns just the foreground. So could I put this in the chain? I could, but I'm not going to, because what I like to do is I like to do kind of multiple, have multiple light wraps that do kind of different things. One's a big general light wrap, and another one that's going to be a softer or a tighter, more sourcey kind of light wrap. So with this, what I want to do is I just want to generate the wrap. And they all kind of have this ability to do that. I'm just going to take the intensity and set it to 1, and there it is. There's our light wrap that's kind of generating for this whole thing. So to make this, bring this back into our scene, I'm going to use a merge node, and I'm going to set this to be screen. You can also use plus, but I'm going to use screen and bring that in. We'll connect this in here. Now let's take a look at our whole scene. And I'm going to disable this. Oh, it's so subtle right now, so subtle. So let's just crank it just to show. So there it is at 10, right? And that's too heavy, right? If we come over here, we'll see it a lot around these trees because it's based on luminance. So it's where our clouds are bright, we get more light wrap there. And so usually I might do something like this where it's 10, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up the diffusion on this. So we'll come out to like 50 and 50. And what that's going to do, if we now crank this up even more, right, we can see that we get this big kind of big haze, right? This big kind of hazy thing going on. And that gives us kind of this thing, blurring out the scene in those areas. Let's go 200, right? Creating kind of this overall, wrap from the sky. Now, I would never do it at that intensity. I do it something lower like that. So if we take a look, right? Again, it's ever so subtle, right? It helps us to kind of put in those last little details. Okay. Another thing that often we'll do is I'll come over here and I'll put an edge blur. Whoops, where'd that go? Put an edge blur, and I'm going to put this on my background. So back on this background piece, we've now added this edge blur. And let's just crank up that size. Oh, it's affecting the whole thing. I don't know. Let's see here. This might be a better function in Nuke. This might be a node that was from the community, because it's definitely doing some, it's finding like the edges within the internals of this render. Really what I want is just an edge blur on this outer mat. All right, well, we'll leave that off, at least for Natron. But that's another thing that you can do. You can come in and add an edge blur here to kind of help with that. We can see that we do have some little dark edges. And those dark edges are coming from, you know, this stuff that we're doing here, where right there you can see that. So this is our grade. And it's because we, in this particular grade, we're cutting off a part of that mat, right? So if we look at this to this, we're losing something. So let's take a look deeper at this. So here in our regrade is where we're losing this. So we're going to try an experiment here. We're actually going to do, oh, fascinating. So putting that back to 0 actually probably restored a lot of that. Nope, we still got a matte line. Working with masks is like your alphas is one of the like critical most parts of all of this work. You don't want to introduce artifacts through compositing. So, which is exactly what I'm doing right now. All right, so one thing that we could do is we could use an erode or dilate. Let's see. Sorry, you jump between all these packages and they all name everything just a little different. So it's dilate. We're going to try edge extend. Let's try this node here. That's a fascinating little node. Size, and let's see, filter. I'm not sure why I just changed on that. Going to delete it and drop down a new one. Oh yeah, it's got like a little blur function in it, which is not my favorite. But let's give it a try. Right, because essentially we're just trying to come up with a mask here. And let's see what this does. Let's see, that gives us a better result there on those edges. Might not be as good here. Oh, seems to be okay. So let's leave that and let's come back to our overall. That definitely is much better by not having that dark edge, which we still have the tiniest bit of one here. It doesn't read as much because we're not pushing as hard, but already we've got a much better look. So now, what are the other things that are benefits when we're working inside the comp? Well, one of the things is if we've rendered it out correctly, we don't have to relight things as much. You know, for small lighting tweaks, we can do that inside of our composite. Let's see here. What do I have as far as layers go? Sadly, I don't have a great set of render passes. Ideally, I would have rendered out each light onto its own pass instead of having this be, right now, this is all together. All the lighting is all together. When you have lights per pass, then you can go in and you know, molt it up, molt it down. But even with this setup, I could add just a regular color correct in here and having these different passes. Oops. this A needs to come off of U. Always important to keep your comps clean and easy to follow. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so now with this, I can come down here and on this color correct, you know, maybe I feel like my foreground's just too dark. So I can come in and multiply that up. Maybe. Here's a great, I had set my viewer to be combined diffuse. So when I'm multiplying this around, of course that doesn't do anything because I need to be on the color channel. So there you go. So now I can come in here and looking at this, I should be able to come in. Oh, that's not doing anything either. All right, sometimes the trick is you just disconnect your viewer and reconnect your viewer. And now you can see that I'm able to go in and make adjustments. So again, it gives you the ability to come in and say, well, maybe I want to push up my gain a little bit, right? Let's go like 3. That starts to get to me feeling a little too light overall, but I like some of the highlights that are happening. And so then I can come back in and say, great, let me just bring down the gamma just a little bit, and that'll just pull down on some of those. That's too far, right? You have to be careful because, you know, we always want to go in and check our darks to make sure that we haven't gone, you know, too black anywhere, and keep all of our stuff nice and clean. So again, be really light with the gamma just a little bit, but there. So now this pops nicely. So before we were this, and now we're here. So it just feels like we're bringing the attention into that foreground a little bit. You know, maybe we'd have our character right here, but this is really starting to look really nice. I would want to do the same thing here probably in my mountains. I'd punch up my key light just a little bit more, let that, you know, kind of come out. But now you can see how if we were to go back to where we were, let's just set that up real quick. I'm going to put down a merge node just right here, and my background is going to be my sky. My next is going to be my deep mountains, then my midground, and then my foreground. So now we can compare the two and just how much difference that starts to bring up. Not that this is terrible and not that this is amazing, but as far as telling the story and creating something that is visually starting to feel like we're making some interesting creative decisions, right? This starts to pull us into that space. So compositing is a super helpful tool to going in here and creating something that stuff that's, you know, to render out all of these volumes in CG, especially for how big our scenes are. You can do it. We can create a box for that and render that out. Sometimes there's not the bandwidth. Sometimes you've forgotten. If you always make sure and you have certain utility AOVs like world position and camera depth, then you can go and start creating very interesting comp solutions to address notes, you know, hit those things where we're being asked for. Because again, we could do the same thing that we did here on our midground to create our little valley haze there. Let's do the same thing to our foreground here. So what I'm going to do is this needs to be, what are you looking for? Oh, because I disconnected it. What are you looking for over here? You're looking for position. So I'll connect that there. And now these values obviously don't work, but we can come in and we'll make this to be 5. Okay, too high. 1, too low, 3, there we go, 2, 2.5. So now we have a haze, which I'll admit my environment actually slopes up as it goes into the background, so it's not great. And I could combine this. I could create another mask, right? Where I'm trying to get something that feels right in the green channel, you know, maybe 2.5. Let's go back to 3. And what I can do is I can either use an expression on a color correct node, I think it is. I know Nuke has this. I don't know that Natron does. Where did that color correct get dropped? So what I'll do is I'll take this one here. I'm going to copy and paste this. We'll do a shuffle. And I'm going to shuffle the green in, the blue into the green channel. So now if I look at this one, my blue I'm hitting green. That's my blue channel, and mousing over I can see that I have values, which is great. Let's put this in here. My farthest away trees look like they are 4,000 or 400 something. Getting the results I wanted. Hold on, sorry. All right, I put the blue channel into the green, which means my blue should match. Or the green should match the blue channel. Let's do this. Let's zero out the blue channel and make it easier. So that's my green. Okay, cool, I see what it is. So the white point on this is going to be something like 475, and then this is going to be, because I think it got more, so we're going to make this 490. There we go. Now this stuff can get ugly and nasty. This is where you have to have a really good clean render to make this work. Some of the semi-transparent stuff isn't working super great, but now what we can do is we can take this, right, which was for our ground fog. This is where actually having this value that helped. Okay, so we're going to multiply these two together. So again, what we're trying to get to is we're trying to isolate this kind of patch. This render is probably just not good enough. We're also getting some nasty stuff around the edges here. Where, check that out, that goes really high. This would be where it's great to clamp. But now, if we look at this, so we'll come here, and again, this is imperfect, but we'll see we've got this kind of mask that's creating that haze, and now we can push that back, and it's keeping it back in this area. Now, This is again goes back to semi-transparency issues, so there needs to be higher sampling in order to solve these problems. So we also still have some matte edges, but gives you the general idea. You could also go in and garbage matte stuff and, you know, all that fun 2D trickery that helps it out. But there we created something that based on distance, this becomes reusable. You know, if the shot changes, you know, slightly, you don't have to go in and do stuff. So, okay, I actually don't like this one. I'm going to leave that one off, and we'll go back to this. So, there we go. Okay. I hope this helps. Again, the power of having really good AOVs is really critical. Okay, so that does it for this week. I hope that helps. If you have questions, clickety-clack and leave them in the comments. Definitely a lot of advantage to learning how to work with comp when you're a CG artist. So even if you're a 3D person and you're like, comp's not for me, understanding how those tools work and how you can best serve up materials to a compositor if you're working in a larger studio where there's multiple departments is a critical skill set to have. Hope this helps. Thanks for watching.